Hello, students. Today we're going to discuss wildlife and especially sort of get into some of the terminology that you need to be familiar whenever we talk about wildlife and wildlife management. Now, to get started, when we mention wildlife, I think the average person, the person you might come up to in the street, they probably think of wildlife as something along of bucks, ducks, and big mouth bass. And that's typically the perception of wildlife. Uh, Wildlife being what we would call game species or game animals. And so we'll get into that and talk a little bit about what those are. But again, let me remind you, I'll be going through this fairly quick, a lot quicker than I would normally in the classroom. So if you need to pause to take notes, please do so. All right, so when we talk about wildlife, it actually encompasses a much broader view of animals. It includes snakes and small mammals, birds, amphibians, and fish. I mean, wildlife is a very broad category. And really, when you get into sort of a definition of wildlife are animals that have not been domesticated. And I'll speak a little bit about that, but wildlife are animals that have not been domesticated. Now, there are two great groups. The smaller group is what we call game animals. Game animals are those animals that have a season, a bag limit. They're animals that we hunt or trap. And so they have a season. And so there's controls placed on what's called their taking. So anyway, game animals, these are animals that are hunted or trapped. They have a season, they have bag limits, they have specifications on how they can be taken. So anyway, the game animals are animals, again, that have a season and they have some kind of limit or regulations on them. Now, non-game animals, that's easy. That's everything else. Animals that we don't hunt, trap, or think of as having a season. Now, when we talk about domesticated animals, that gets to be sort of a difficult and blurry line because, once upon a time you might have said, oh, well, a red fox is easily a wild animal. It's not domesticated, and yet there's been a lot of work put into helping them become a domesticated animal. And I'm not going to make you do anything from this chart. I just want you to kind of see that the first domesticated animal was, of course, the dog. And you come on and you get to some of the smaller ruminants like sheep and goats, pigs, cats came later, and on down the line. Is the fox going to be the most recent domesticated animal? I don't know. If you read about them, people claim they're the best of both worlds. They have all the traits that we like about dogs, but also the traits that we like about cats. So anyhow, that line can get a little fuzzy at times. Now, we do utilize wildlife in a number of different ways. One of the ways is to educate the public. So you might go to a program at a state park. These are some of my former students that are either while they were students, actually working with animals. Now, ideally, if a wild animal is taken to a park to be rehabbed, the idea is for it to be able to be released back into the wild. Sometimes that's not the case, so those animals are used for programming. But again, the goal would be to get them back out into the wild. Now, there's some terms that I want you to be familiar with. These deal with wildlife relationships. So, for example, we have parasitism. You can just think of parasites. These are where you have one type of animal living and feeding on another animal without killing it. So you have the parasite, you have the host. The parasite feeds off of the host. So an example would be wood ticks, nasty little boogers that can attach to you. They can live on almost any warm-blooded animal, and they don't particularly want to kill their host because that's their free meal. So ideally, they would be attached. Now, another relationship is what's called mutualism. And that's where you have two types of wildlife living together for the mutual benefit of both. They both benefit. So, for example, you got tick picker birds. You know, they live with a number of different herd animals. They'll crawl on them and they'll pick bugs and ticks off of them. So the bird benefits from getting a free meal. The animal that is getting the ticks pulled off of them, they're getting parasites removed. So both benefit from that relationship. And you often see this with herd animals, whether it's like these egrets with this herd of elephants. They'll feed off of the insects that are attracted to the elephants. And they also benefit from the presence of these large animals to keep away predators that might harm them. So they both benefit. Now, one type of relationship that you're probably familiar with is predation. That's where one type of wildlife eats another type. And so when you have predators, they capture, kill, and eat prey. And so an example of this is foxes that keep down populations of rodents and other small animals. Another term that you need to be familiar with when we talk about wildlife relationships is competition. And that's when we have two types of wildlife eating the same source of food. So that means they're directly competing with one another. And this can be a real problem when we're talking about exotics. So if an exotic comes in an area, it may outcompete a native. And that could be devastating to the population of the native species. But an example here is foxes and owls. They both compete for rodents and other small animals. So another type of relationship is competition. And then finally, we have commensalism. This is where you have one type of wildlife living with another without harming or helping it. The example I give here is vultures waiting to feed on the leftovers from another animal's kill. You'll see this a lot in areas where you have large predators. Like, for example, you have a grizzly bear, and you can tell he's grizzly by that hump on his shoulder. But this grizzly bear is feeding on a bison. Now, did he kill the bison? Probably not. Most of the time, grizzly feed on carrion. They will find it and where it's died from something else, and then they'll feed on it. It's possible, but more than likely, it found this bison dead and is feeding on it. Now, if that grizzly takes down a bison and then feeds on it, gorges himself, and then leaves, there's a very good likelihood that there's still material left on that carcass that other animals could eat. So you might have vultures come in. Coyotes very often have figured out that if they follow grizzlies around, that there's typically a free meal involved. Other birds will do the same thing. So anyway, the grizzly doesn't benefit from, say, the coyote. Coyote doesn't do for the grizzly, but the coyote does benefit from the grizzly's activity. Vultures waiting to feed on those leftovers, they're an example of that. Now, when we talk about wildlife resources, there are 1.5 million species that have been identified. And if you look historically, 99% of all species are extinct. When you look back over the timeline of history, most species have gone extinct. And so extinction is not a new thing. In fact, it's been around as long as animals have been around. Now, why do species decline? Well, there are four main reasons. I'll start over here on the lower left and sort of go I'll go clockwise. So first one is invasive species. Invasive species are species that don't belong here. They're not naturally here. So for example, in this image, you see a little house sparrow coming out of basically a bluebird box. And in fact, they caused a decline in our native eastern bluebirds. Those species don't belong here. They're invasive. They were brought from someplace else, and so they don't belong here. And so they're one reason why a species could decline. Another reason, going up over on the left side, is exploitation. If we just simply hunt and have no regard for replenishment and we just overexploit it, remember, we defined exploitation. It's the use of a resource without any concern for future availability. Well, if you don't care about the future and you just exploit it, just use it up, it could decline. A big one coming around the clock here is habitat loss. And we'll talk about habitat. Habitat is its components. It's not just plants. It's not just one individual thing. There are these components that come together. So habitat loss. If you have a species that's very dependent on a particular kind of habitat, like, for example, in China, you have the bamboo forest, and that's where you have the giant pandas live. And all they eat is bamboo. So when those forests disappear, so do they. And then a combination of others. It might be that you might have an invasive species that maybe kind of knocks it back some, but stresses a species, but then exploitation then really knocks it back. So it can be one of these four items that actually causes a species to decline. Now, we did talk about the Endangered Species Act, and the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. It was very unique at the time. No place else in the world had done anything like this. And so you had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service charged with, they had to create and add to that threatened and endangered plant and animal species to a list, so that you may have heard of the endangered species list. Well, Fish and Wildlife, they had to create it, they have to maintain it, and they add animals and plants to that list. Now, once an animal becomes endangered, they're responsible for researching why. Was it habitat loss? Was it disease? What's going on? Why did it become endangered? That was their responsibility. Then they're responsible for creating a recovery plan for each threatened and endangered species. So they try to understand, why is this species endangered? What do we need to do to bring it back? And they also have the right to acquire critical habitat, because very often what you're going to find is that species decline because of loss of critical habitat. Now, some other components of the Act, it prohibits the import and export of endangered animal parts, things like feather, fur, teeth, any of that meat, any of that stuff. It's prohibited. This next bullet, the second bullet here, is probably the most controversial part of the law itself. It prohibits the public and private. So this is going on affecting private land from taking, and notice I have taking in quotes there. That just simply means whether I kill the animal or destroy its habitat. So it prohibits the public and private from taking threatened and endangered species. Now, it's controversial because it means on your property. For example, if there's critical habitat identified on your property, you can't change it. And in fact, it would be a violation of federal law if you did. And so it's very, very controversial. And finally, National Marine Fisheries Service, they handle any kind of marine fish that fall under this category. Now, what are the tools of wildlife management? What are the things that we use to manage wildlife? Well, there's hunting control. So we might have, for example, if we have a fairly stable population of something that is desirable to hunt, we may have a season on it. And so we set a limit, a bag limit. I keep mentioning that. That's the number of species it might be that you could kill in a day or a season. For example, when I was a kid, white-tailed deer numbers were so low, you were, depending on the region you were in, but in the region where I lived, you were only allowed 1 buck a year. That was it. Whereas now, you could kill multiple deer during the season. In fact, depending on the methods you use, and both bucks and does and all that, you could theoretically kill well over 100 deer. So, hunting control. Predator control. Now, historically, predator control was taking predators out of the system, trapping, killing, removing them. Now, we think of predator control very often as putting predators back in the system. Now, there's still some situations where predators are trapped and killed, but very often when we think of predator control now, it's thinking about putting them back into the system. Refuges, places, refuges, places where animals can feed, reproduce without being hunted, without being messed with. Artificial replenishment. That's where, for example, if a species disappears from an area, we bring it from another and put it there. I mentioned wild turkey before in class. When I was a young man, when I was a kid, we didn't have wild turkey in Texas or in Tennessee. We didn't have wild turkey here in Tennessee, but they were brought from Texas, and they have replenished, and actually their numbers have taken off to the point where we can now have a regular season on wild turkey. But the wild turkey we hunt now originated out of wild turkey from Texas. And then finally, environmental controls or habitat improvements. And again, we'll get into habitat here shortly. Now, habitat is not one thing, and it's not just plants. There are a lot of different things that go into habitat and what makes up habitat and what an animal needs from habitat. So, for example, an animal needs cover. It needs protection from the elements and protection from predators. So, cover. Wildlife need food from their habitat. They need to eat. So what do they eat? Well, some animals are what are called europhagus. They eat lots of different things. So they have extensive food types. To me, the best example of this is a coyote. I think of a coyote as like a goat. It will eat anything almost. I mean, they'll eat plants and berries and persimmon fruit, and they'll eat mice, and they'll eat white-tailed deer if they get them, and all. I mean, they just eat all kinds of things. They do not have a limited diet. Whereas some animals are stenophagous. They have a very limited food type. So I mentioned earlier giant pandas. What do giant pandas eat? Bamboo. Well, what else do they eat? More bamboo. And as you can imagine then, a species that's europhagous, that eats lots of different things, typically we don't worry about them being endangered. Whereas those that are stenophagous, they have a very limited diet, sometimes they can run into trouble. Other things, water. All species require water and space. Now this amount of space and kind of space varies. So we've talked about edge before. That's where two communities are coming together, like a forest and a grassland. That creates an edge, and they like that edge. Or corridors where they can move without being exposed. So, the woods around a creek provide a corridor for them to walk along. Now, animals have a home range, that's what they would defend, and then they have a territory, an area that they might range within. Obviously, home range is going to be smaller, what they're willing to defend, but territory could be quite large. For example, a male grizzly bear has a territory of 100 square miles. So it's got to have a lot of space. And we talked about the fact that in wildlife we're concerned about population. And there's some terms and dynamics that you need to think about and remember. So we have birth rate, and the term for that is natality, and it's the number of live births per female per year, because some species can have multiple births multiple times a year. For example, a small house mouse can have several litters through the year and actually have several pups per litter, whereas other species may only have one live birth a year. And so that natality rate is going to vary from species to species. Then there's mortality, and that's the death rate. Well, you can only die once, so how number of deaths per year. Another thing that will drive dynamics or drive the population is immigration and immigration. And I hate that both these words sound very similar. So the immigration with the E, you can think of it as an exit. So you've got a concentrated population. Maybe you've got too many bulls in this population. And so some of the young bulls have got to leave. And so they immigrate out. They exit, the E immigration out, exit out. If you've got a small population, and it tends to be that population flows from larger concentrations to smaller concentrations. So if you've got a small group, you might have where they come in, the I immigration. So the immigration where they leave, you can think of it as the E for exit. The immigration where they come in, you can think of I as coming in. And so these four items cause the population of a species to go up and go down. We'll skip that. Mortality. What are some of the things that cause mortality? Mortality is basically the death of an animal. We talked about habitat. Loss of habitat can cause mortality. Starvation. It's like this scene that you see here where this deer is hiked up trying to get something to eat. That's usually a bad sign if white-tailed deer are having to hike up. Now, not always. In the spring of the year, sometimes you'll see bucks hiking up for certain leaves. There are a lot of different explanations why I've seen bucks do this, and there's been no real rhyme or reason. But anyhow, typically when you see deer hiking up like this, that means that food's not readily available, and that can be problematic. So you've got starvation. Predation and hunting, both of those are similar, where they're killed because they've been taken by a predator or taken by a hunter. Disease. Animals get diseases just like we do. And so they might catch some illness and die. They can have accidents. For example, you see roadkill. They don't necessarily want to be road pizza, but, they get run over. Some crazy examples of this. When my grandfather was a young man, he witnessed, this was over in Middle Tennessee, over on the Cumberland Plateau, where a pack of dogs was chasing a buck. And the buck was just, bolting away from the dogs and ran off a cliff. Another example of that actually happened here on campus a number of years ago. There's over at the University Center, there's actually a step. It's got a gate in front of it that goes up to the roof of the University Center. Somehow a deer ended up there and panicked and leaped off and obviously died from the fall. But anyhow, accidents happen to animals just like people. And then poisoning, whether it's wild cherry leaves or seeds and berries that they're not accustomed to eating. If they're hungry and they're pushed into a food that they're not used to, they might eat something that's poisonous. So poisoning can happen. Now, when we talk about wildlife, we have generalists and we have specialists. Generalists, they can live in many different places. They can eat many different things. For example, if I said, I saw a white-tailed deer, that doesn't mean anything because it doesn't tell you that I was at a particular place or anything unique. Whereas if I said in the wild, I saw like a snow leopard like this one, you would know if I saw it in the wild, that meant I was over in the Himalayan region, probably Tibet. And so they're very much a specialist. And so some animals are generalists, some specialists. So obviously generalists, typically we don't worry about them being endangered, whereas specialists, we do worry about them being endangered. Now I mentioned carrying capacity a while ago. Carrying capacity is this idea that an area can sustain a certain number of wildlife. And it's dangerous to talk about it as a target for management because, as you can see, very often you can overshoot that carrying capacity. So, for example, this region might be able to support roughly, 1.6 million of a particular species. Well, if you end up with more than that, the area can't support it, and the population will crash, and it goes kind of back and forth like this. This line is actually misleading because what happens is if it overshoots and they overeat, they actually damage the carrying capacity, so carrying capacity declines. So the trend line for carrying capacity actually would be downward, and you just kind of go back and forth over that as it trends down. So it's a very dangerous trend. So it tells us something, but it does not need to be a target. And we tend to think, for example, predators, they control prey. But what we find in the numbers is that, and very often the reverse can be true. In this case, the number of snowshoe hare determined the number of lynx that would be following along. So in that case, it really was the prey controlled the number of predators. Now, this last section I want to talk about R selected species and K selected species. I want you to notice that the R is small and the K is a capital K. Now, what does this mean? Well, it goes along with this graph right here. If the growth of a species follows along this exponential growth where it just starts off slow and all of a sudden just dramatically just keeps growing up, that's R selected, and it follows a logistic equation, and it just dramatically takes off. Whereas sigmoid curves or K selected, K actually means 1,000. So like in theory, your carrying capacity might be 1,000. The population will grow toward that, and it sort of will taper off. They generally don't, they grow rapidly for a short time, but they begin to taper off. Whereas R selected, they just shoot straight up until they crash. Now, I want you to look at this list. I want you to, now at first blush you see this and you might want to freak out, but the truth is, if you look, you'll see a trend. Are selected, they have a high rate of increase. Well, we saw that on their growth curve, and they increase dramatically. They have a high juvenile mortality rate. That means when they're little, they get captured and eaten or killed very often, whereas K-selected have a low juvenile mortality. And we'll talk about why I think that happens. Because you've got a high rate of increase and high juvenile mortality, you've got rapid population turning over. They're younger at first breeding. Their body sizes are smaller, shorter lifespan, low population stability. They have what's called precocial young. That is, once the young are weaned, they're pretty much just pushed out on their own. Whereas altricial young, they might stay with their parents for a year or 2 or 3 or maybe even more in some cases. And so the parents protect them. That's why they'll have lower juvenile mortality. The parents are very involved, and so they're referred to as altricial young. But our selected species are often pests, game species, often generalists. And then K-selected, they're often endangered, often specialists. The way I always could remember this is I picked an animal that helped me think about it. So like for our selected species, I always thought about field mice. They have, high rate of increase. So that little field mouse, she's going to have a bunch of pups this year. Once they're weaned, they're kicked out on their own, so they're running around and they're eaten up, so they have high juvenile mortality and on down the line. K-selected, I often think about bald eagles. Low rate of increase. The clutch will have 3 or 4 eggs a year, typically raising no more than 2 or 3. And so on down the line. So that would usually help me remember the difference between these two. So anyway, you might use that same tool for yourself. All right, this wraps up our discussion on wildlife. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to email me. This is Dr. Philip Smart